Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J and welcome to the first time I'm making a video like this. I've done video reactions before, but not any explicit responses, usually because if I find a channel's argumentation to be less than stellar, I just move on with my day. However, when browsing the internet a few days ago, I got thrown this exchange of someone who decided to make some interesting statements about Frieren beyond Journey's End. For the unfamiliar, it's a manga and anime series that takes the whole anime fantasy setting and decides to start the story after the big bad demon king has been defeated. It follows the character Frieren, a near-immortal elf, as she retraces the steps of that adventure to process the grief from a friend's passing, and seeks to better understand humans as she goes. Stellar story, by the way. I don't watch a lot of anime, but this made for a nice exception. So, what prompted me to make this video response? Well, because the guy decided to make a big deal out of highlighting comments about how people dislike his video after only watching the first 5 minutes, assuming they watched it all. And to be fair, this is a problem when you're dealing with long-form videos. Some people simply aren't going to have the time for it or wish to commit to it, and will want the too long didn't watch. Hell, I'm subscribed to Mauler, so I've heard the long man bad joke a fair amount. However, I'm also guessing that I'm not going to agree with this video, since I don't see there being a moral dilemma with how the show portrays demons, a fact I can infer based on your thumbnail. So I watched through the overwhelming majority of it, and I have some thoughts. Looking over the introduction, the video starts off on the wrong foot. His summary of the show is accurate, but there are 2 lines that stand out to me.
To make it clear, I have problems with the show. I had them while it was airing, but I couldn't quite figure out where they were coming from, because I didn't want to dislike it. After all, it's highly praised and universally beloved and the #1 anime on my anime list by such an absurd amount that it might stay there forever. Its premise and story is right up my alley. I don't even dislike Naruto's exam arc, and I love powerful One Punch Man type characters and fantasy action.
Now, wanting to like something isn't particularly a bad thing. We want to enjoy the media we consume after all. I just finished watching Arcane Season 2 for instance, and wasn't expecting it to be on the same level as the first season, but was still hopeful it would get there. And visually it was spectacular, though I'll be curious to see if the writing component holds up to scrutiny on a rewatch like the first seasons did. Given how a certain paradox is resolved, I suspect it might not, but one can hope, right? Getting back on topic, what has me curious is that he listed Frieren's popularity as the first reason for wanting to watch it, before going into how the contents of the show theoretically line up with his interests. I get wanting to feel included as part of the crowd that really likes something, as it can be fun to share that enjoyment with others. But if that's the first thing you're mentioning when saying how you want to like something, it makes it seem as if that's the primary reason, when that'll be seen as a shallow reason at best. As a result, you will then have people wondering, did he really want to like it, or was he just bandwagoning? It would have made more sense to exclude that part, in favor of talking about the elements that should have landed with you. Or at least make it more explicit that you're checking it out because a lot of people recommend it, not just due to it being widely viewed. Second, he says this.
So when I was watching it and it wasn't working for me, I feel like maybe I just wasn't getting it. Maybe there's something I was missing. So I left it alone, and I stopped thinking about it. Up until about 9 months later, when I made a tweet about how the demons in the show are kinda weird, and people sent me death threats.
And I've been called a brainless faggot for having too long of an introduction on a video. What's your point?
So now I get to use the power of my YouTube channel to prove my point.
Yeah, that doesn't sound spiteful at all. Just to be clear, before someone clips this out of context, yes, it can suck to receive death threats, and it can suck to be called names. But you can't control what people say. You can influence it a little, you can tell people what you'd prefer, but you'd have better luck telling the wind to stop blowing than to tell someone to shut up. I will explicitly say right now, do not send this guy hate. But the words of a random low-sub YouTuber won't magically stop someone from giving you hate if they're so inclined. Broadly speaking, there seems to be 2 approaches to people being unreasonable or mean online. The first is to say, this is terrible, something must be done about it. The second is to say, this is terrible, I need to be mindful how and how often I engage. Based on the comments you've made on Twitter, you seem to fall into the former camp, which is frankly an unhealthy approach to the issue. You've been posting videos for a couple of years now, according to your YouTube history, and some of them have gotten quite a lot of attention. Good on you for that. Because of that, you should know by now that it doesn't matter how well received your words might be, there's always going to be that one weirdo who gives you death threats or calls you a slur or what have you. Hell, not even fleeing to Blue Sky seems to have helped for those who are trying to get away from Twitter. You are far better off laughing at the people who are only here to throw insults and slurs, in favor of the people who honestly engage with your points. Of course, I can't politely point out that issue because you restricted who can reply to you at some point in the 2 months between your initial tweet and your video, with this image perfectly encapsulating the problem. Here's someone who says you have thin skin, you presumably laughing at them for it, but then confirming the point with your actions by making a quote tweet that person's only way to talk to you. You are starting this video in a confrontational manner. And if we agree that, hey, people shouldn't be mean on the internet, that also applies to you, and you should not be surprised when you're greeted in kind. Of course, we eventually reach a point where we go into meta discussion, so we'll continue this conversation then. So, not off to a good start, but let's see if the arguments are good, and this introduction is just that, a bad introduction to an otherwise well-reasoned video. For the most part, his summary of the show is accurate. We can quibble over minor details, as he says that Frieren ends up with an apprentice, quote, at the behest of the last living party member, end quote, but since Aizen is still alive, that's not entirely accurate. Minor details like that are largely irrelevant to this discussion though, so I'll just mention it as such and move on. As you'd expect from the introduction and thumbnail, the focus of this video is on the nature and handling of demons in the show. He accurately points out that there's not much of a connection to biblical demons, which is true, as they are described in the story as monsters that evolve to mimic human speech and emotions, as a means to better hunt them. They can be seen as demons for their seeming mercilessness, but since this is a Japanese tale, I wouldn't expect any major parallel to biblical demons anyway. He is also accurate about how Frieren approaches them, which is to kill them without mercy. He frames it as her loving to slay demons, which I feel is an exaggeration, as given her approach, it's more calm recognition of, oh, there's a demon. We can't exist in the same world without killing each other. I have a ruined village back home to prove it, so let's get this over with. Hell, the fact that she had to be prodded into action 1,000 years after her master taught her how to be the most effective demon slayer possible should be evidence of that. Though admittedly, this was also because her mentor told her to live a quiet life until called forth to slay the Demon King. So, what's Lextorias' perception of the demons?
They're the main antagonists of this story. They're fantasy villains undeserving of any sympathy, who we're told should be killed without mercy.
Yes, because they operate on a completely different and fundamentally incompatible moral code to humans.
Or well, we're told that.
Yes, through the writing and characterization. Do you disagree?
They are monsters though, a vague classification in the story that basically just serves as a catch-all for anything you're not supposed to feel bad about killing.
Good, you came around to that, so we at least agree on enough of the substance to have a proper discussion.
Dragons, mimics, big fucking wolf things, they're all monsters, which in the world of Frieren means they're evil, and they dissolve into mana upon death. It's this very video gamey way of basically telling the audience don't worry about it.
That's arguably conjecture, but considering its prominence among fantasy and isekai settings, it's not worth making a fuss over. What is worth making a fuss over is this statement.
However, even from their introduction, demons are shown to be very different from every other monster we encounter in the story. Most importantly, by being much more intelligent. Dragons are said to be maybe the second most intelligent of the monsters, but they don't really do much to act like it, and things like mimics and beasts are just completely mindless. It is only in demons that we see actual human intelligence, and quite a lot of it.
Okay, I know this is semantics, but the words we use are important, so I'm gonna be that guy. You should have said human-like intelligence to avoid confusion. Because by saying human intelligence, you are immediately trying to sidestep the framing the world provides. Demons are not human. They merely appear and act human to make it easier to hunt their prey. To say that they are on the same or similar level of intelligence as humans would be more accurate and get your point across better. In fact, you even clarify this later in the video, that they make themselves look like children or speak eloquently about family members they don't possess, for in their mind they have no concept of same. They only know that these are human aspects they can use to drop a human's guard and make them easier to kill. You even show the points where the story goes, hey, when Frieren says we're beasts that wish to kill humans, that's accurate.
So the story makes it incredibly clear very early on and tells us over and over again that demons are evil.
I agree. But given the framing, you disagree, don't you? Where's the but?
Monsters that kill and eat people without remorse. Any bit of emotion or empathy they might show is just a part of their deception.
Come on, you're repeating yourself. I know there's a but in here.
So, if you see a demon on the street, you should kill them, because they're definitely going to kill you.
Wait for it.
Frieren actually wants to go so far as to eradicate them entirely.
Wait for it.
But
there it is.
But the problem with this is that while the story is telling us they are mindless, immoral killing machines that warrant the protagonist wishing for their destruction,
telling us? They're showing us!
It often shows us something very different.
The fuck, you say?
And I'll just go over a few examples.
Oh, something concrete we can argue over is forthcoming? Alright, I'll put away my reaction clips. Let's see what you've got for us. The first example is the first time we see a demon in a village, where they're being welcomed as an envoy. He accurately summarizes the scenes, where Frieren is arrested for wanting to kill a so-called demon diplomat, the leader of the town wants to kill him too to avenge his son, and the man's hand is stayed when the demon mentions his father being slain. Only they then have a subordinate demon ask what a father is. Which, actually, watching your video did lead me to come up with a criticism for this scene, though different from what you'll be mentioning. In short, she really shouldn't be asking when there's a guard right there. This is a conversation that, if you were going to be this heavy-handed, should have been had exclusively in private, which makes these demons appear more unintelligent than is otherwise portrayed. Though this is admittedly only a problem in the anime, depending on how charitable you are, as the manga doesn't show a guard being nearby when the question is asked.
This is a scene that completely baffles me, because why would the other demon even bother to ask this question?
That is a fair question to ask, as you'd think the subordinate would already have some knowledge of the term in order for her to be effective enough for the role she's to play. It would make more sense to have her scoff at how foreign the concept of a father is, not asking what it is. Of course, since demons are intelligent, you could just as easily argue that the subordinate may have had no use for the term thus far, and therefore it might have come up in conversation. So, before we move on, do we have any other problems with this scene?
1, this means that demons seemingly don't have their own language and just use human speech to talk to each other, even when humans aren't around, which directly contradicts them telling us there's only one reason they speak like humans.
That's another reasonable question, and the story doesn't give us a direct answer for it. If we're being charitable, we might assume it's said as plain Japanese, or English I guess, for our benefit in a meta sense, especially given the guard issue I mentioned earlier. But for the sake of argument, let's assume they're speaking in a human tongue when this exchange happens, in and out of universe. At the risk of potentially giving a headcanon response, if you've already adapted a useful speech pattern that you all understand to some extent, why wouldn't you use it? I'll grant you that it might be better communicated if there was a guttural demon language of sorts that clearly differs from human speech, but given that the only demon hierarchy is me strong, you weaker, one which only exists to ensure demons can deal with humans acting as a group, words aren't wholly necessary to maintain that. There's a reason we created language in the first place, and if demons are already perfecting use of it to get one over on humans, why wouldn't they use this perfectly good communication tool with each other? It does go against the literal statement of, quote, there's only one reason why man-eating predators would speak human language, end quote, but can coexist next to the spirit of the statement.
2, if language is just a tool used to deceive, and they already picked up what a father was based on context clues, well enough to be able to use it in a conversation, why would they care what it means? The word has already served its purpose. They've already figured out how to use it effectively. To inquire about it further means they have a willingness to understand human language beyond just deception and out of genuine curiosity, which also directly contradicts what the demon tells us.
You know, considering you're going to be bringing up Macht later, this is a strange question to ask, because his whole deal was, humans are weird, can I understand them? Even as it led to him turning an entire village, including its inhabitants, to gold. Curiosity from demons about how humans tick is something that comes up a few times, and is reasonable to expect since understanding your prey may help you to better hunt them. It's also a reinforcement of the whole our systems of morality are so incompatible that we can't coexist, since demons have such a foreign understanding of human customs that even the term father is meaningless to them. From here, Lextorias' video and the story move on to a flashback scene to give us a sense for why Frieren is so hostile towards demons. In that flashback, a demon that looks like a child killed a human child, and was about to be met in kind. Frieren steps up to kill the demon, but with this being a flashback to the old party, the main leader, Himmel, stops her, as the demon asks for her mother, and coexists for a time in the village. Until she kills the mayor, burns his house down, and offers his child as recompense for the one she killed. Because the only thing the demon understands is that she took something from the human, and therefore offers what it conceives as a suitable replacement. Because she doesn't understand the nature of familial relationships, due to the fact that demons don't have parents as we understand them, that enrages Himmel into being the first one to strike. Even if demons understand, oh, mother and father are the ones who birthed the human, they won't understand why we treat that as a big deal, because they don't have that kind of parental bonding in whatever constitutes growing up for a demon, as Frieren says in the scene, which you're seemingly aware of because that clip is in your video. Because the demon system of morality is so incompatible with human morality that any attempt to coexist is doomed to end in bloodshed. I'm gonna be repeating that line a lot, aren't I?
And again, this is a reveal for the audience. It's just laying it on thick that demons lie and kill, and that's it.
I will admit the show lays it on thick throughout, but this is not the scene to critique that approach with, since this demon has no reason to lie about this because it's literally on death's door. So what was the reason for bringing this up again? Because I don't see how this is a negative example.
But importantly, it shows they lie out of self-preservation. In fact, that's the most common way we see them deceiving people, begging for their life. Which is also strange because we're explicitly told they are being deceptive by doing this, yet they are genuinely begging for their life. They genuinely don't want to die and are acting afraid of dying in order to not die.
Before I respond, this is not well worded, as it took me a bit to realize what you were aiming at. To steelman and more clearly state the argument, we are only ever shown demons lying when their life is threatened. As a result, we are not seeing them as they are, but rather as they are when backed into a corner. And since humans are also more likely to say whatever's required to get out of a tight spot, it's not unreasonable for them to lie to act out of self-preservation. In that respect, humans and demons do have something in common. The problem with that argument is that a lie is still a lie, regardless of when or why. Even if it's made out of self-preservation, the village example is still one where a demon is trying to avoid being killed for murdering a child. I would consider that deceptive and cowardly regardless of whether it was a human or demon saying it. If you wanted this point to land, you should have added that it would have been good to see a demon lie when there isn't a sword pointed to his or her throat.
But if that's not enough, demons show actual genuine emotion all the goddamn time. They are often described as prideful and arrogant. They feel genuine excitement and anger and shock and fear in ways that cannot be explained by them just imitating humans to get an advantage, as it is so often not beneficial in any way. With demons calling Frieren a bitch or getting mad at her when she kills them, or expressing some emotion when humans aren't even present, sometimes even in their inner monologue.
Yes. Is that a problem?
Going even one step further.
Okay, at the risk of being rude by cutting you off mid-sentence, are we not going to answer that point? Then let me cut to the heart of the matter. Demons can experience emotion, but they cannot experience empathy, and as we'll later learn, cannot comprehend guilt or malice. That creates enough differences between humans and demons to where it makes sense why the two groups have incompatible moral systems, since they physically can't view the world through the same lens.
One of the first big fights in chapter 20, the conclusion to the demons pretending to make peace with the town, ends with one of the demons getting cut in half by Stark, and the other demon crying out their name, which gives Fern enough of an opening to kill them. The way the anime frames it makes it seem like they might just be calling for their ally to help them, but they do cry out after the other demon is dead, while looking in their direction, after it's already been established they can sense when another demon dies. So this feels almost intentionally written like the demon is crying out because their ally died. And it's made pretty clear the crying out is what drops their guard and gets them killed, which looks to me like a pretty clear-cut expression of empathy.
I disagree. At best, this is conjecture, and at worst, this is projection. The scene you showed of them recognizing their ally was dead? I didn't see a whole lot of empathy when they were talking about it after that observation was made. Because of that, it's more reasonable to assume that he's turning out of either shock, fear, or anger, as Stark has just done something that by his words in that battle should have been impossible. His ally, namely Linny's unique power, allows her to mimic the abilities of people she's observed before, allowing her to match Stark blow for blow by adopting his master's technique. However, Stark is able to surmount that, as he finds that it doesn't favorably compare to his master, and he pushes through because of it. This catches LotR off guard, and with how tight of a contest it is between him and Fern, that one moment of shock is enough for her to land a lethal strike. In fact, reading over the chapter, he even calls out for Linny to finish Stark off due to LotR being on the back foot, so he'd clearly be surprised when she's bested. In short, I suspect you are falling into the same trap Himmel did in the village flashback, projecting emotions that don't exist within LotR simply because he appears human. One could argue I'm just projecting different emotions onto him, but since it makes more logical sense for that emotion to be shock, fear, and/or anger at Linny's death, which both fits what we've been shown about demons and adequately explains why LotR would act this way, I know which interpretation I prefer. This is not a clear-cut case in your favor. Even if I act on the assumption that this is an expression of empathy, that doesn't mean it's genuine. Since the display of empathy and tugging on a human's heartstrings are part of a demon's defense mechanism, this outburst could easily be an instinctive, I'm supposed to act this way to elicit pity from a human, a heat-of-the-moment decision that won't work against Fern and leads to his death. It's not a strong argument, admittedly, given how cold and calculating he's otherwise shown to be, but as I've already said, he's on the back foot for this fight, so reverting to instinct isn't outside the realm of possibility.
Now, you could maybe argue that the demons have just gotten so good at mimicking humans that they do so involuntarily.
Oh good, you're preempting the assumption. Let's see how you respond.
But if this is involuntary, often completely detrimental, and ingrained within the demons so deeply they even do it when nobody else is around and cannot stop doing it to save their life, then there is functionally no difference between the mimicked emotion and the real thing.
Oh, we're taking a consequentialist view on morality then? Yeah, no, I'm not going to agree with you on that. By that standard, if I kill someone in self-defense, then I'm no better than the person who is trying to kill me. Never mind that I'm acting out of self-preservation instead of the other person acting out of malice, the outcome is that someone is dead and I'm responsible now, so I must be the bad guy. Intent matters. Whether they truly feel that empathy matters. And they don't. Explicitly.
Though perhaps the strongest contradiction in the demon's nature is that they do actually have some sense of morality. The one thing you would think they obviously don't.
I've been writing most of this response as I go, but it's curious to see that I've already preempted this discussion a little bit by talking about the demon's moral framework. Yes, they do have a moral framework. Might makes right. We may treat them as monsters due to their actions, but as you've said, their intelligence elevates it beyond just pure instinct, and adds an intellectual and moral layer to the matter. I don't see that as a contradiction, but do we at least agree on the nature of their moral framework?
Because we're also told that to demons, one's mana level is a source of pride, and almost all demon hierarchies are simply built on who has the most mana. So a technique that Frieren has mastered to be effective at killing demons is to suppress her mana at all times, to appear to have a low amount, to trick a demon into fighting her so she can kill them. It's something she's even taught Fern since pretty much the beginning. This is already interesting because it directly mirrors how demons trick humans with words to kill them, and it comes across as Frieren playing by their rules to get an advantage, literally using that arrogance the demons are described as having against them.
Good, we're on the same page. So what's the problem?
But the more interesting part is that when that demon from earlier, the one who cried out at their ally dying, learns that Fern was concealing her mana, they call her a coward. They are visibly disgusted by it. Because again, demons are proud of their mana and think concealing it is a lowly thing to do.
Yes, this is internally consistent. What's the problem?
So the demon's morality might not align with ours. They're still totally okay with killing after all, but they must have some sense of morality to believe concealing mana to trick them is wrong. There is no reason they would react this way if they didn't.
Yes, this is internally consistent. What's the problem?
A truly immoral being would not think there is such a thing as an action that is wrong. And there isn't even an explanation of this being part of their mimicry because it's something only demons care about.
And there's the disconnect. I'm surprised you don't understand what's going on, considering you said this pretty recently.
So the demon's morality might not align with ours. They're still totally okay with killing after all.
Since it's seemingly unclear, let me make this as simple as possible. By our morality, they are evil beasts who slaughter humans and hunt us at least in part through deception. By our morality, they are immoral. By their morality, people like Fern are immoral. Our moral codes are incompatible, therefore we see conflict and bloodshed whenever the two sides meet. Also, to get into semantics again, a being that wouldn't have a concept of right and wrong would be considered amoral, not immoral. What it sounds like is that you're acting as if the demons have been portrayed as emotionless and amoral, which is an interpretation that I'm not sure how you came to, given literally everything we're shown in both the manga and anime. A wolf is amoral because it acts as instinct demands. A demon is not, because there's enough intellect for it to develop a moral code consistent with its predilections. It is still fair to call them monsters for the whole hunting humans like prey bit. The next point he brings up is to look at The Lord of the Rings, given that it's a pivotal book in how most fantasy settings are portrayed, with long-lived elves and irredeemably evil faction, all that jazz. Yes, this is about to be a discussion on orcs. As in Tolkien's work, they are a twisted perversion of elves which have diverged so far as to be unrecognizable on a physical or moral level. Rest assured, before someone asks, he's not one of the idiots who will try to tie the Tolkien portrayal of orcs to a real-life group of people. Strangely enough, we're about to get to the best part of the video. To that end, he goes into detail about how everything evil in Middle-earth can be traced back to Morgoth, which lines up with my understanding as well. He also brings up how Tolkien's view as a devout Catholic inspired this, with the whole evil cannot create only mock line coming up. So we seem to have at least enough common ground on how the world functions, but why bring this up?
So when we get to orcs, the most basic and simple and one of the oldest and most influential evil fantasy creatures, J.R.R. Tolkien encountered a problem, a moral dilemma, where in many of the stories they show up in, orcs are able to speak. They're able to make decisions, express emotions. Treebeard describes them as participating in orcish mischief. And I mean, they still kill and eat people, they still don't have any human morality, but they understand what morality is, and consider some actions to be right or wrong. So just on the basis of all that, they must be sentient. They must have a soul. And when the books treat them as unsympathetic monsters that are killed in the thousands, you can see where Tolkien had an issue.
Wait, weren't you applying consequentialist morality to the Frieren demons a while ago, saying how their facsimile of empathy was so precise that it functionally was that? Suddenly we're okay with looking at the intent of a creature and the possibility of change, huh? The irony of this section, though? Even though I think it's an inconsistent moral standard on his part, I agree with him on this point, because this is a thread I've heard before and have had time to mull over. I'm a practicing Catholic as well, and the faith holds that no one is above redemption, to the point where while we might declare someone a saint, i.e. someone who made it to heaven if they've lived a virtuous life, there's never a point where the church will say, yes, this person is in hell. For who are we to question the extent of God's mercy and his power to save? In that respect, hell is a conscious choice to not accept the love of God, and therefore not something we can definitively state someone is in, because we as observers cannot know another's innermost self. I hadn't heard a definitive source that backs this up before now, and credit where it's due, Lextorias has a works cited page in his website and in the video description that points to where he retrieved the information from. I don't have time to scour the source for the exact words, but I could understand why Tolkien would grapple with this if we act as if it's true for the sake of argument. If the orcs are indeed corrupted elves, then that means in theory they could be uncorrupted, and are to an extent deserving of mercy for having been forced off the straight and narrow by Morgoth. The idea of an irredeemable sentient being is something that is incompatible with Catholic teaching. Well, depending on how you define sentient beings anyway. If you include demons in that term, then they were given that one choice to accept or reject God's will, and cannot have second thoughts later. Still, that's getting in the weeds, so back on topic. That in mind, I'll be curious to see how Lextorias extrapolates this point. In my opinion, having an ontologically evil group or villain isn't necessarily out of place. Even if it might be in conflict with my beliefs, it's okay to have a group which is ontologically evil for the purpose of storytelling, so long as it's internally consistent. By how it's been described, that's not entirely the case with The Lord of the Rings, as killing orcs is seen as a good thing by basically everyone, even though humans like Boromir have a chance to turn back when they screw up. However, what might be an interesting argument is how much that applies in practice. Do you really have time to negotiate or bring out the orcs' better nature, whatever if it may remain, when they're actively trying to enslave or kill you, especially in the numbers they're shown? That may be an issue with how the books portray them, but it would also be how the characters living on the ground understand them, as there would be plenty of people who would only know them as the vengeful marauders, and would therefore view them as ontologically evil for the sake of survival. That wouldn't apply to knowledgeable people like Aragorn or Gandalf, but it's an interesting discussion to prompt. It's a shame we don't have a more definitive answer from Tolkien, as Lextorias points out. To try and justify this, Tolkien effectively wrote the origin into ambiguity, as none of the reasonable interpretations satisfied this dilemma. Given that Tolkien's aim was to effectively revitalize a founding myth with The Lord of the Rings, such ambiguity wouldn't necessarily be out of place, but may be frustrating for those looking for an airtight universe. Though, to be fair, real-life mythologies aren't exactly airtight either. Hell, the only major point of contention I have with this section is the fact that he labels Boromir as evil, when I would only say he was merely misguided by his desire to do good, and committed an evil act because of it. Still, that's largely immaterial for the purpose of our discussion, so let's get back to Frieren.
Going back to Frieren, it should be obvious from everything I've set up that we encounter the same dilemma that Tolkien did. If demons are pure evil, they shouldn't really be sentient, and if the demons are sentient, they shouldn't be pure evil.
Not necessarily. The difference is that orcs were once elves but turned away. Demons have evolved from a different evolutionary route entirely and hold a different worldview because of it, even if they've adapted to look like humans to better hunt them. As you've mentioned, there was no overarching evil influence that led them to their current state, and as I've repeated a bunch already, they're operating from a completely different and incompatible moral framework to our own, with humans viewing them as evil by their standards.
We've seen plenty of evidence of them showing emotion. You can make a strong argument that they express empathy too.
See prior part of video for why I disagree with this assessment.
So if we handed Frieren to Tolkien and asked him to evaluate it, I strongly believe that he'd think the demons weren't worthy of mindlessly killing. They should have a soul, and any evilness on their part would be due to a conscious choice or corruption, which could always be reversed.
Again, demons are not just corrupted humanoids, but an entirely different kind of creature that operates on a completely different moral framework to us. The orcs have a framework too, it's just diametrically opposed rather than irreconcilable. So I'm not prepared to state what Tolkien's stance on Frieren's demons would be one way or the other. Going further into your argument, there is one curious thread you follow after all of this, namely that even if we remove the concept of a soul and take out the religiosity from it, at least from Tolkien's view, the essence of what is meant by that still matters. To be specific, the demons can reason, are self-aware, are intelligent, and capable of speaking with us. Therefore, mindless slaughter isn't wholly justified, and at best you can only say, well, it's a pity we're so incompatible, but because of that, neither can live while the other survive, so sorry about that. However, it's easy for us to say that as dispassionate observers who don't have to live it. We didn't lose our entire village to demons, Frieren did. She has had centuries of experience with demons where, from the first time they demolished her village and killed everyone she knows, they have only ever been a menace to her. Even if you, as a dispassionate observer, may think there is some reconciliation possible, that's not how Frieren would view it, because of her lived experience. If you want to pass that off as a moral failing on Frieren, that's your prerogative, but what it tells me is that she's a well-written character with ample motivation to act the way she does.
Orcs and demons are sentient, intelligent, and morally capable beings. Therefore, they must be capable of reason, self-awareness, and change. They can't be pure evil because they have the ability to choose not to be. They already have their own system of morality. There's no reason they couldn't adopt another.
No reason they couldn't adopt another? That depends on the type of morality they're trying to adopt. It is explicitly stated that they do not understand empathy or family, as much as you've tried to argue otherwise. Are they capable of change? In theory, yes. But there is also something so fundamentally different about demons that such a reconciliation between humans and demons is mathematically impossible.
Now, individual demons may still be evil, and many in the story are, but due to the nature of the dilemma, it shouldn't be the entire race by default.
Again, this is an easy judgment to make when we are the dispassionate observers and not the people who have lost everything to demons like Frieren and Stark. And when we're working on the faulty assumption that they can feel empathy, which they can't. Explicitly. Which you've only brought one shaky example that might disprove it if viewed through the right lens.
The demons that committed atrocities and participated in a violent war are not excused by the knowledge that they may have the ability to become good. The demons killed throughout the show are almost always instigators to conflict, after all. But it does raise disquiet about Frieren's intent to eradicate them.
What, besides the literal 0 times in the world's history we're aware of where one of them has been an overall moral good in human society? What do you know that the rest of us don't?
Anyway, it's time for manga spoilers.
Okay, I'm curious to see where this goes, but you should have either shortened the time on that alarm or lowered the volume, because that was a bit abrasive in the last couple of seconds.
From what we've seen of the demons in the show and what I've talked about so far, there are some serious questions raised, and the manga does directly try to answer these, and has an entire arc focused on the possibility of coexistence between humans and demons. And so now it's time to get into that. Spoiler alert, it doesn't go well. Now, the specific arc I'm talking about is the Golden City arc, or El Dorado as the most popular fan translation calls it.
And here's the section on Macht. I eagerly await to see how you attempt to square this thread away given your prior comments about Linny's curiosity about the term father. But before we get into that, we've got a side point to attend to.
Leading into El Dorado, there are a couple of interesting interactions with the demons we see, most notably being another example of a demon asking a question about the meaning of something. This time why humans care about their dead, before getting dismissed again.
Oh, so the dismissal of the other side's worldview extends to demons as well. That helps my argument more than yours, but carry on.
This demon is actually a young child who is shown to be happy and energetic like a human kid even when humans aren't around. And in an interaction that honestly surprised me, they kill a human, look to their superior with a smile on their face, and say, I did it, master, praise me, and then get cut in half.
Based. Even in your assessment, the demon just killed someone and is gleeful about it, showing no remorse or regret about having to do it. And since we've seen a demon that appears as a child in order to better hunt their prey, the mage is entirely in the right to do this. And that's before I mention that your framing of the situation is incorrect, as before this, the mage had the larger demon cornered after a lethal strike, at which point, a human child seemingly shows up out of nowhere and has a sword thrown at it by the demon. On instinct, the mage defends the child, only to find that it was a demon working under an illusion. At which point, when the younger demon foolishly thinks the mage is down, he gets cut in half in retaliation for what could have been a lethal stab wound. Even without your framing, the mage is entirely in the right to do this, and with more context, it's even more justified.
What the fuck?
Excuse me, you have a problem with this? We've been shown that even younger-looking demons are willing and able to murder others. We've just been shown this particular one gleeful, not empathetic, gleeful about killing a human. And him being met in kind is a what the fuck moment? Is this why the media literacy term has been run into the ground?
Why? They think the human is dead, clearly, but they're showing excitement and looking for praise from their superior? A demon, a creature described as this emotionless antisocial murder monster, is bursting at the seams with a desire for approval.
I'm sorry, since you're saying it again, I'll say it again. I must have missed the point where the demons are described as emotionless and antisocial, given they have been described throughout as having emotions and a social hierarchy, however basic that hierarchy might be. I mean, seriously, you were able to conjure up manga panels and anime clips for everything else. Where's the proof for this claim if you're going to be repeating it so much?
It cares enough about this other demon that it wants them to praise them?
Pride. Pleasure that comes from some relationship, association, achievement, or possession that is seen as a source of honor, respect, etc. This is an adequate description of what we're seeing. It's not a matter of caring for the other demon, but respecting their authority due to the power disparity and wanting their approval. Not empathy, not consideration, pride. Stop overcomplicating this scene.
What?
My words exactly, though we do have a different aim in mind. Can we move on to El Dorado now?
Anyways, we eventually get to El Dorado.
Thank you.
And for anyone who hasn't read it, who skipped my spoiler warning, the basic premise is that a powerful demon, Macht, one of the big boys in the Demon King's army, has turned a city to gold and has been sealed inside it by a magic barrier. Long story short, he was the advisor to a lord of a city who put a bracelet on him, ensuring that if he ever harbored any malice towards anyone in that city, he would die instantly. Yet, he turned the whole place to gold anyways. Curious.
Okay, we're on the same page so far. And it is an interesting detail, I agree. Almost as if the demons view their actions as simply the natural way of the world without there being any need for an emotion like malice, and therefore they never developed it. And therefore they can't understand why we view them as malicious for wanting to kill us. Almost as if there's a reason for the different and incompatible moral codes.
Short story long, we spend several chapters exploring Macht's memories, where we learn that demons do not actually know what the concept of malice and guilt even are. Macht says he understands all the other emotions, fear, anger, sorrow. This is what helps confirm demons feel these things for real, by the way.
As you've said already, and it's a point I'm not disagreeing on. So can you ask whatever straw man you're arguing with to leave the room so we can stay on topic? Speaking of which, he then goes into detail on the story, how Macht met the Lord of El Dorado and how they became accomplices, the man to grow in power and influence, and the demon to potentially learn how to feel malice and guilt, who finds that, oh, nothing's worked so far in the last 20 years, so let's turn this city and everything in it to gold, and that didn't seem to do anything to trigger those emotions either. When asking other demons about that, the answer is a matter of convergent evolution, that humans and demons look similar, but if demons had evolved to feel empathy or guilt, they wouldn't have been able to so easily engage in deception to obtain their aims. By the end, it's made clear that in attempting to coexist with humans, whatever intention Macht may have to do so, the end result would leave too many dead to be worth achieving that. By Frieren's account, that was the Demon King's aim as well, and in the ensuing conflict, humanity's population was cut down to a third.
So this changes basically our entire understanding of the demons.
How so?
Now the question of evil is fully shifted from any kind of magic or divinity towards essentially biological determinism, the idea that they're programmed to act this way and don't have any way of stopping it. Demons are born to hunt and kill, and it's so deeply ingrained in their alien nature that that's just how it is. They're not evil out of malice, just out of instinct.
Is the story wrong though? We reject biological determinism when used to justify something like racism because we are similar enough to each other that such prejudices can be overcome. However, there is a certain truth to it, such as the fact our bodies evolved to have larger brains than other primates, which allows us to engage in these hypotheticals to begin with. Your body and mind are inextricably linked and do affect your perception of the world. We can argue over how much credence we give that, given the example I mentioned earlier, but one cannot wholly separate body and mind. Having said that, what makes it a problem when applied to a fictional species that is very different from our own?
And I've seen people argue that morality shouldn't even be applied to the demons at all because of this.
Well, as I've hopefully demonstrated, I'm not that person, so we'll skip past you clarifying that they do.
And they already have an understanding of morality. That's the most important part here. They have a concept that you can do something wrong because that's how they view Frieren's trickery. They just don't understand that killing people is wrong. They do not lack morals, they just have a hard time adopting ours.
If you're already aware of this, then what the hell is the point of your video? That's an adequate explanation for the examples you brought forth.
Also, just because I've seen so much of it online, evil does not have anything to do with maliciousness. The fact that they feel no malice towards the people they kill means effectively nothing. By human standards, and the standards of the story, killing innocent people is morally reprehensible. It is an evil thing to do and to be okay with doing. The emotions you did or did not feel during, be damned.
Well, we can agree on that at least, as someone can do an evil act without intending it to be evil, so I won't make a fuss about that point. From here, there's some more talk about them not being wild animals, which we've already discussed, so let's move on.
Here's a demon being sad their friends are dead and helping another demon because he reminded her of them.
Well, if you have individuals that necessarily interact with each other, even if the only purpose is to effectively deal with groups of humans, and you tend to get along better with particular members, the idea of a demon having a friend isn't entirely out of the question. They may use the same word, but they wouldn't conceptualize it the same way we would.
Here's a demon saying they use fear to control other demons. Here's a demon doing a fucking yandere smile because they just love fighting so much. Macht, when he dies, goes and visits his best friend for no other reason than because he misses him. I'm just gonna stop considering this a point I even have to argue, because it should be obvious by now.
Thank you, that was getting repetitive.
But as you might guess, even after changing our understanding, we haven't changed or solved the dilemma at all. Shifting the demons from the classic interpretation of evil beings created or corrupted by some dark force to what are essentially sociopaths with a serial killer gene doesn't change that they're beings who we're told are wholly irredeemable because of this.
Yes, it does. Considerably. If their nature was one thing but contorted to be diametrically opposed, that is a very different situation than their nature remaining consistent as they've evolved. Having your nature contorted implies that it can be reoriented. Starting from that position doesn't necessarily allow for that.
The story is still claiming every single demon is unworthy of mercy, and Frieren is in the right for wanting to eradicate them. She knew about the demon's desire for coexistence all along, after all. This isn't even a revelation for her. She doesn't care if there's a chance they might change. She wants them all dead before that can happen.
Because there has never been a chance for change in all those centuries that Frieren has been interacting with them that hasn't ended badly.
And the story never elaborates on why this change is so difficult.
Because they can't experience malice or guilt, for crying out loud. There is an entire emotional dimension by which demons cannot understand us. Are we even reading the same story at this point?
It tells us it's difficult, that they just can't fathom empathy and not killing, and that they'd kill every human before they got anywhere, but it just defaults back to it being in their nature, which is apparently something they cannot overcome, even though humans and other races clearly can.
Because in the real world, humans only have to deal with other humans. This is an Ender's Game where by the time one side realizes the true nature of the other, that the wheels are already in motion for their extermination. This is a setting where the two sides cannot comprehend and find repulsive the actions of the other on a fundamental, instinctual, and intellectual level, despite attempts being made to bridge the gap. How is this hard to understand?
Frieren's entire journey is about learning to connect with others emotionally, even though that's not in her nature as an elf. That's literally what the story is about. But with the demons, it just repeatedly says, it can't be done. That's just the way it is. And you'll never know why, because they're aliens, so we'll never understand them.
Are elves so diametrically opposed to humans that they can't coexist without one side inadvertently exterminating the other? Elves may not be human, but share a lot in common. Demons are also not human, and share a lot less in common. If you don't like it, that's your prerogative, but that is the nature of the story and setting.
And the strangest part of it all is that this is happening while one of the most prominent themes throughout this arc, the one that Frieren herself faces, is the idea that nothing is impossible.
Okay, now I'm intrigued instead of just annoyed. Carry on.
It's a theme that exists throughout the story, but here they specifically focus on it. We see Frieren give up several times because she thinks something can't be done. And we see someone alongside her keep trying anyways, and through their efforts they convince Frieren that it's possible, so she does it.
I can agree with that. So what observation or question would you like to make based on that?
Nothing is impossible in this world, says the manga, while having a character find it impossible to overcome their nature, while Frieren says it is impossible for demons and humans to coexist without bloodshed. And while the story tells us it is impossible to understand the inner workings of the demons.
I'll grant you that this can seem a contradiction at first glance, since the nature of magic is also down to what the mage believes is possible. So this idea of anything being possible is baked right into the world building in a way that cannot be unmoored without serious implications. So, on the face of it, saying that demons cannot overcome their nature, that they are destined to always hunt and kill humans, even when they attempt to compromise and understand them as a means to avoid future conflict, seems contradictory. However, I would argue that this is actually something that makes the world feel more real, because the statement that anything is possible is not just a platitude that is reinforced at every turn, but must be met by the reality on the ground and weighed against other virtues. To use a real-world example, since we've mentioned Catholicism once already, we can look to the definition of mortal sin. For a sin to be considered so severe that it would bar someone from entering heaven upon death, the action has to fulfill 3 criteria. First, it has to be a grave matter, such as adultery or murder. Second, the person who committed the sin must be fully aware that what they want to do is a grave offense. Finally, the person must commit the act of their own free will. Because of this, it is not considered a mortal sin to kill in self-defense, as that is not a decision made in a vacuum where you have premeditated the action, but instead is a last resort. In fact, because of that last point especially, there is plenty of debate among Catholics as to how difficult or easy it is to even commit a mortal sin. The reason I bring this up is that there's a perception of Catholic doctrine being very rigid, and not without reason given how it's remained largely unchanged since the Church's founding. However, it also recognizes that we as humans like to make things complicated, and therefore it can sometimes be difficult to know what the right course of action is. Because of that, even something as severe as taking another person's life can be recognized as a grave offense but seen as permissible in specific circumstances. Not ideal, not what we would have preferred, but permissible in very specific circumstances. To tie this back to Frieren, the anything is possible shtick is a major theme of the story, right down to its magic system. However, ideal does not always mesh well with the reality on the ground. In this example, you are forced to make a moral judgment as to whether to value the idea that anything is possible, allowing demons to try and coexist at the risk of human life, or to say that the cost is too much to bear and stopping the attempts at it. What the story has told us is that there have been 2 instances where demons have attempted to coexist. In one instance, the cost was 2/3 of humanity, and it didn't work. In the second, the cost was the population of El Dorado, and it didn't work. Yes, if it could be achieved, then there would be no more suffering caused by human and demon conflict. But what price are you willing to pay in order to achieve that? After seeing and experiencing the suffering these attempts have caused firsthand, Frieren's answer is simple: no more. Humanity will not suffer the grief of losing more and more people on a maybe. Therefore, demons cannot be allowed to coexist with humans. This is not a rejection of the idea that anything is possible, but instead the preservation of human life being treated as a greater virtue. Oh, and there's also the part that because Frieren was the first one to successfully dispel Macht's curse, Macht is going to compel a fight to the death, so this moral conundrum is arguably irrelevant because Frieren has no choice but to fight or die. Interesting conversation, I'll grant you, but not the one to use to back up the point you're trying to make.
So by now, I hope you can understand the part of Frieren that has been stuck in my mind ever since I first watched it.
I can understand where the train got derailed and how that happened, but nope, I don't see what you're seeing. And because of that, your attempt to loop this back to Tolkien's dilemma following this statement and implying that it's a problem that demons are seen as evil rings hollow. The demons in Frieren's world may have intellect, but they do not have the capacity to understand why humans view them as evil, and therefore have no reason to change. Because of that, sentient beings like humans and elves have to act as if they are ontologically evil, because if they don't, that is a self-correcting mistake. If you don't like it, that's fine, but at least state that after amending this disconnect.
If we take a character like Ubel, someone shown in the story to be fine with killing pretty much anyone, who has killed a lot and doesn't feel bad about it, who explicitly uses charisma in combat to get an advantage, and we compared her to a demon who did pretty much all of the same stuff she did, can you think of any reason given by the story why Ubel would deserve mercy and be allowed to live, and the demon would not, that does not boil down to because they're a demon?
Dude, Ubel's magic is literally geared around intimately learning about a person in order to mirror their technique. And not just in the manner that Linny does, where she just sees someone's movement and can replicate it, but has to understand that person on a fundamental level and cannot use that to mirror any old action, only to replicate magic. The very empathy that demons don't have is precisely how Ubel learns new magic. Of course, you'd probably throw that into the because she's not a demon category, wouldn't you? Even though that's a major distinction to make, as she's been able to live among other humans for years by this point, and hasn't slaughtered entire villages because she doesn't understand the concept of family. She understands human morality, she just doesn't follow it all the time.
People call Frieren's handling of the demons a sort of subversion of a subversion, taking the idea that many pieces of media take the evil fantasy race from Tolkien and do actually try to redeem them. So Frieren not redeeming them is subverting that. But the idea of subversion is that it should add an interesting element to explore, or take some idea and build on it in a way you weren't expecting.
Well, at least we can agree that The Last Jedi is poorly written trash then.
Yet Frieren's demons are doing the exact opposite. They are stripping away interesting ideas to revert them back to their simpler form.
I feel like you're reading too much into this, but carry on.
The show's most interesting exploration of the demons, I would argue, is the El Dorado arc, which is entirely focused on their inner workings, yet results in the same conclusion we had going into it. It asks a lot of interesting questions just to give answers we already knew.
Is that a bad thing? It's possible for one to have a hypothesis only for it to be proven right. That's the whole reason we make hypotheses in the first place, to make an educated guess as to what we think will happen. We're not married to it, or at least we shouldn't be if it gets proven wrong, but having a guess and being proven right isn't necessarily a bad thing. It may not be as satisfying from a storytelling perspective, as then our character can't grow into a new understanding, but not every moment needs to be this groundbreaking revelation.
It wants its villains to be more compelling than Tolkien's orcs, while still having them be fundamentally the same at their very core.
Please present an interview with the manga staff confirming this before making such a claim, as the text does not support your read of the situation. Also, you're repeating yourself again.
And this might be presumptuous of me to say, but a lot of my problems I have with Frieren are based on this same situation. The story taking a very simple idea, typically a trope from an earlier work like Tolkien's, and dressing it up as if it's going to be more complex, only for it not to be. Frieren is often praised for having better world building and setup than the typical fantasy isekai people hate so much, yet from the Tolkien races to the demon villains to the magic association, it uses all of the same tropes to build its world.
So? You don't need to completely reinvent the wheel just to tell an interesting story. I've already mentioned how the magic system is a matter of the wielder's imagination, which allows it to operate like a soft magic system. But they also have a hard limits based on the user's mana, and by extension their experience using it. This leads to there being all sorts of interesting expressions for magic, whether it be the rigid, straightforward kill with soul track mindset Frieren beat into Fern, or manipulation of the elements, or even something as simple as making sweet grapes sour, which Frieren collects because her mentor loves collecting oddities like that, and one of her party members preferred sour grapes to sweet ones. I know I'm derailing this a little bit, as the world still has a lot of the trappings you'd see from a typical fantasy setting, but the point is that you don't need to go full Sanderson with your world building, as so long as it's told well, it can be as simple or complex as you like, so long as it's in service of the story, which Frieren's is. The praise it gets is not without reason.
Frieren is even an overpowered and rather simple main character, like many anime are criticized for having, further made less interesting by virtue of the story continually proving her right about everything, especially regarding the demons.
Yes, and it gets away with it by giving a reason for its in-universe rather than in a meta sense, such as living for millennia, being trained by the best mage of her day, and for having significant personality quirks that have a notable negative effect on her social standing. She's incredibly powerful, but people don't just kiss the ground she walks on merely for existing, which excludes her from being called a Mary Sue. Another reason why I like the show, by the way.
The story is also praised for not focusing on combat as much as your typical shonen battle formula, and for having an interesting use of magic.
Oh hey, there we go.
And yet, not only is it very combat-oriented, with an unironic Chunin exam battle royale and a straight-up assassination plot taking up a bulk of the story.
Yes, but even though it's a common element, the battles are not the focus for Frieren, but a means to an end. She is on a journey. She is collecting odd spells along the way. And to get past a certain point, she needs a first-class mage rank for either her or Fern. And sometimes the adventure involves a bit of demon murder. People don't make a big deal about it because it's not Frieren's reason for the journey in the first place.
But the combat, more often than not, devolves into something very similar to a shonen battle anime, just with magic as a substitute for a power system, spells substituting unique abilities.
And they gave us an easy-to-understand magic system to underscore that rather than just saying, people have these powers, you don't care why, let's just get to the action. I think that would be considered a step up.
The very structure of the show is set up to be a subversion of your typical adventure story, taking place after the journey is already done.
I wouldn't call it a subversion, more a different focus, but go on.
Yet the entire plot is still a major quest to reach the Demon King's castle that plays out and ramps up exactly like a traditional story would if they were on their way to defeat the Demon King. Traveling to dangerous lands and defeating stronger and stronger enemies and taking time to stop major threats. It's not a journey beyond Journey's End, it's just another journey.
Yes, hang on, let me check this real quick. I know it's in here somewhere. Yes, the ramp up from El Dorado to Imperial Assassination plot. Those two really feel like a ramping up of similar dangers and troubles they have to work through with a clear and concise through line instead of things that Frieren gets roped into because she happens to be around. Come on, I get what you're going for, with the northern lands being more dangerous due to their proximity to the Demon King's castle, but the contents of the story don't bear that out, as the kind of dangers are substantially different and aren't a strictly linear trajectory.
Like I said in the beginning, I don't want to dislike Frieren. I think all of its ideas are right up my alley.
Could have fooled me.
Lord of the Rings is one of my favorite stories after all. But I think there's a big difference between The Lord of the Rings being a simple and straightforward story and not trying to be anything more than that, and Frieren wanting to do something different and interesting, but ultimately just wrapping back around to being simple and straightforward.
Okay, I've probably implied this already, if not outright said it, but I don't see why you're making such severe comparisons between these two works. The discussion around orcs you brought up is an interesting one to ponder, and I appreciate this video on that count. But due to the nature of the antagonistic force, with the orcs being corrupted and the demons simply existing naturally without any divine or fell influence, the only similarities the two works have are the common trappings like long-lived elves. There's no place like Rivendell that we're aware of, at least not any we've been told about, and much of the interactions with humans are in isolated villages or city-states rather than large kingdoms. More to the point, the journey being undertaken and the tribulations along the way are things that are happening more to Frieren than because of her, as she finds herself roped in not necessarily because she wants to be, but because she is well known and still has some lingering inclination to do so from when she traveled with Himmel. I like both stories, but outside of the basic fantasy trappings, that's where the comparisons begin and end. If you had a point on the orc versus demon comparison, I might understand it better, but you're undervaluing the differences between them in favor of an argument that doesn't work, which leads the comparison to fall apart as a result. The rest of the critique part of the video is merely summarizing his points, and hoping that something big is going to upend the status quo given the direction the manga may be going in. So let's move on to the final section of the video, as we started with him mentioning Twitter, and now we get to end with a section regarding the meta discussion, mostly involving Twitter. Since this video was prompted by a tweet he made, let's see what he posted. Oh, and before we get too far, this is me cutting in as Editor J after doing some retakes, as apparently sometime between the last week of November and the start of December, he locked his Twitter account. So, unfortunately, I'm reliant on what I've already collected and what he showed in the video, and can't easily prove a future statement I make about him totally not being mad on Twitter for days if not weeks over people not liking his video. So, when looking at the tweets he showcased, I'll just zoom into the relevant example and maybe have some fun with the editing depending on the circumstances. That out of the way, back to rambling. First, we have a tweet he's quoting, but didn't write, saying, quote, "This line went hard, but not gonna lie, I'll never forgive Frieren for this. Like, I get it, all demons are evil yada yada, but this is an unbreakable spell where she can make her do anything. She could have helped society as a whole, but instead she murdered her cause she hates their kind." End quote. The line in question? The moment where Frieren subverts a spell that compels the weaker mage to do whatever the stronger mage says, which Frieren uses to say, "Aura, kill yourself." Yeah, really raw line, and a savage way to take down a demon. Naturally, I disagree with this tweet, because it doesn't work from a logical standpoint. Because we've seen that the spell can be resisted with enough willpower. Even if Frieren doesn't know that, which to be fair, only Fern and Stark were told that outright, she wouldn't take the risk to find out if Aura has a means to overpower or circumvent the spell, and would simply think, "No, you're a demon, I know exactly what you'll do if you break free, you should kill yourself now." Nice sentiment to want a better good out of this perhaps, but one that doesn't work in practice, and isn't something that Frieren would do. In that sense, you're free to be annoyed at it, just don't pretend like there's any other choice that could be made. The only real alternative is that Frieren, once in control, just hits the soul track button. So then we talk about the tweet that the video maker put out that prompted this whole discussion, which, I'm starting to understand why people were upset. Quote, "Frieren is such a funny show. It asks the audience to question the morality of the demons so many times it feels obvious they're going to subvert it, then pulls the rug out to start doing Gary Gygax level biological determinism." End quote. Before I say any more, let me be clear that what I'm going to say is not intended to justify the flack you received, nor saying that it should have happened in response. Instead, I am going to calmly explain exactly what upset people. Because you, sir, made two mistakes. First, you made an argument on Twitter. That's mistake number one. It's taken me a while to lay out my annoyances and praises of your video due to just how much there is to discuss. And on Twitter, you've got a severe character limit. Giving a hot take like the demons in Frieren are morally ambiguous actually, that isn't substantiated, and which I don't agree with even after watching almost 40 minutes of this chonker, isn't going to be received well. To give examples from my own YouTube stuff, I can point to a direct correlation between my like to dislike ratio and if I said or did anything controversial. This video where I gave Brony's favorite media the time of day received very well despite the fact that I said the show was not for me, because I was polite and upfront with my bias and was fair about what the show did well. This video, which I led by calling Breath of the Wild a 6 out of 10, not nearly as well received, because I knew full well that I was being a cheeky bastard by including the hot take at the start and only explaining my reasoning a few minutes into the video. I knew exactly what I was getting into, and I was okay with poking the bear like that. If you aren't prepared to take the heat from poking the bear, don't poke the bear. Second, you made the mistake of invoking a culture war topic, and given the revealed political leanings your statement gives, it's hard to believe you weren't conscious of this, or were unaware of the backlash this would invoke. I'll grant you that even if I don't talk about culture war bullshit myself, I do keep a close eye on it, in part to get a sense for the landscape and to avoid precisely the same mistake you made. So my suspicion that you're conscious of this could be projection. However, when you invoke culture war topics like this, you shouldn't be surprised when people get very upset about the subject, given how fiery said culture war has been over the last few years. To detail that for those unaware, I will be doing my best over the next few minutes to avoid giving any personal take on the matter, instead focusing on representing the arguments each side gives as honestly and fairly as possible. I will likely not be perfect on this, but if I can go this entire segment with you knowing nothing about my political leanings besides the fact that I'm a practicing Catholic, then as far as I'm concerned, mission accomplished. So, quick rundown. Who is Gary Gygax? Well, he's one of the pioneers for Dungeons & Dragons, the game that the overwhelming majority of role-playing games can trace their roots back to in some form. There has been some controversy over him, with Wizards of the Coast, the makers of D&D, distancing themselves from him on account of that. But this has received backlash because it appears to unfairly diminish his contribution to the hobby and to the game market by proxy. It's a similar dynamic you see with H.P. Lovecraft, a matter of separating the art from the artist, and the extent to which we reasonably can or should. Now, the specific contention brought up due to the whole biological determinism bit is in reference to the fact that the fantasy races in D&D typically have particular traits, not all of which are positive. For instance, the betrayal of orcs is a constant subject in culture war discussion, as on one side, you have people who don't mind that a fantasy setting has a group that's ontologically evil, for the sake of just leaning back in one's chair and having a good time rolling some dice with some friends. If it's such a problem for you in that group size, you can always just homebrew something different. On the other side, you have people concerned over how perception of others would be seen if we're willing to accept the idea, even in a fantasy setting, that certain people are inherently a certain way and there's no room for nuance or change. In extreme cases, you may see complaints over any negative vice applied to a playable race, and in even more extreme cases, you get what I mentioned back in the Lord of the Rings section, of fantasy races being seen as caricatures of real-world groups. Having established that, for you to be aware of that discussion, which we can assume since you use the words Gary Gygax and biological determinism in the same sentence, you have to know the kind of backlash you're going to get from it, especially with how different Twitter is since it came under new management. If you somehow don't know that there will be pushback, and if you don't claim to care about it, then why are the final 13 minutes dedicated to talking about online discourse? You insulted a pivotal figure in tabletop and video game history, someone who can't reply to you due to passing away in 2008. Even if you think it's wholly justified, even if you avoided the more extreme arguments on the tweets and in this video, you're gonna get backlash. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but if you stir the water, you shouldn't be surprised when the piranhas start biting. You made a point of moving to Blue Sky to avoid this, and yet somehow you have time to return just to go after the people whom you see as not properly engaging with the subject? What, did you give your Twitter account over to Jim Sterling or something? Oh, and before someone cries victim blaming, if being called mean words on the internet makes you a victim, then I'm technically a victim too, as is literally every YouTube personality with more than 1,000 subscribers. So, with that in mind, let's look at some of these examples you've clipped for us. Presumably these will be the really bad ones that hammer your point home, so we'll be charitable and only look at those for now. Quote, remember explicitly when the show literally says demons use words without meaning to trick humans into defending them? Yeah, that was making fun of people like you, my man. End quote. Given that you didn't have time to flesh out what you mean by question the morality of the demons so many times, that's a rude comment, but not unsurprising. Quote, story writers can explain a concept in the most kindergarten-like way, and yet somehow the Media Literacy Club will say the dumbest interpretation and act like they said the smartest shit in the world. End quote. Again, rude, but you're making a controversial take. You should not be surprised by this after making YouTube videos for 2 years. Quote, we should throw this dude in a Middle Eastern country. His head will be on a pike within 3 hours, so we can learn about differing moral values, end quote. Now that one is uncalled for. Funny that it's the easiest to read of the ones you plastered on screen so far, but I'm sure that's not malicious. And then the next one looks like you censored the N-word, and credit where it's due, it's courteous of you to not show the names or profile pictures of anyone insulting you. Still, he posted an image alongside telling you to shut up blank, saying how you focused on the positive side while missing how, quote, demonkind is a plague incompatible with our civilization, they should be put down like the rabid dogs they are. A very harsh framing, which I don't agree with, as demons are more intelligent than rabid dogs, but considering how the Demon King's actions led humanity's numbers to be whittled down to a third, that is a fair assessment for how humanity would view demons more broadly, at least in universe. Next up, you have something posted in Spanish, which Google Translate returns as, quote, "It amuses me that these kinds of people would be the first to be eaten," end quote. Assuming that's correct, the sentiment is accurate if you take Lextorias at his word that the demons are morally ambiguous, since that's exactly what happened to the mayor in that flashback. The reason Lextorias likely included this, since I don't know if he knows what was said, is because it contains a meme of Frieren casting the okay, come on, don't tell me you took that one seriously. If that were sent to me, I'd be laughing my head off at the sheer contrast between the harsh words right next to Frieren's "I'm so done with this" face. It's rude, but come on, you gotta admit that one's funny. The one after that is an image of Frieren's hairstyle and ears photoshopped onto someone I don't recognize, saying, quote, "I hope you get raped by a pack of wild demons." Again, extremely rude, I don't condone that, but this is the internet, and you can either complain about it or just mute and block when appropriate, especially since it's a quote tweet that, unless I'm misunderstanding how Twitter works, you have to go out of your way to look for. Also,
but I thought it was especially funny that this reaction to criticism about an anime promoting the value of friendship had people calling me more slurs than I've ever seen.
Spoken as someone who has never experienced or doesn't remember what the internet used to be like before 2010. Imagine this guy forced to listen to 10 minutes of old school Xbox voice chat. Oh, the shock on his face would be glorious. After bringing these up, his argument boils down to saying, "Oh, you're not engaging with my argument. You're only here for a gotcha and to push your own agenda while accusing me of bug posting because I gotta bring Starship Troopers up as well. Oh, but I don't care about being called names. Just ignore that screenshot you can grab from my Twitter within a few days of this video going live and the dozens of tweets I've made since that totally make me look like I'm not annoyed. Also, all of you are wrong about your assessment, and I don't understand how you couldn't see the obvious contradictions."
This was far and away the most common opinion I saw, the vast majority of the response to my tweet, outside of the bad faith insults, being disagreements with specifically my questioning of the story's logic, like me bringing up the contradictions was the worst thing I said. And this truly made me feel insane, like actually insane, because after going through the whole story, these contradictions were so obvious to me, I didn't know how someone else wouldn't pick up on them.
Oh, I wouldn't say insane. I would merely say your ideas don't hold up to scrutiny, and if you somehow weren't able to see why people would disagree on this, then your solution shouldn't be to close off replies on Twitter, it should be to talk to people more. Granted, you waited until 40 minutes in to start going into meta discussion, but leading off by saying, "I got death threats so you got this video," creates an air of self-righteousness that's gonna turn people away regardless of how good the argumentation is.
But more than that, I didn't understand why people thought these explanations invalidated my criticism.
Because you didn't say which contradictions in the tweet, so all we could do was say, wait, you think the group of people that relies on deception and mimicry of humans to kill them have moral grace to them? Now, from here we're back on track, as he asks why the creatures are even called demons in the first place. We've touched upon this already, and I don't feel as if there's any new elaboration that requires my input. So all I'll do is just repeat that the Japanese understanding of spirits is very different from the Judeo-Christian idea of spirits, and you have a point in that demon might not be the best word to use to get the point across. Also, you don't need to get fancy with your terms for in-universe and out-of-universe explanation for names. That's gonna make you look like a pseudo-intellectual who has to use the uncommon and sophisticated-sounding verbiage to make yourself sound more intelligent, when we already have perfectly acceptable terms for it. I get why you went that route, since it lets you dig into the etymology of Tolkien's stuff, since we're still on that train apparently, as well as make a distinction between this happened because emotional response in universe, and this happened because actor left project. But still, auxiliary information that isn't strictly necessary, which you acknowledge, yet is still in the video.
But the key point here is explained. In-universe or out-of-universe explanations on their own do very little to actually defend the work from criticism.
Then what's the point of this video? If I said I like Frieren Beyond Journey's End because I liked the part where Luke Skywalker tap danced so hard that he blasted off into space and blew up the Death Star with his magic shoelaces, you'd look at me like I was insane, because I would be! The purpose of the explanation is to make sure we're all on the same page for what objectively happened in the story, because without that, we end up talking in circles. If we can't even agree, for instance, that the demons in this world are operating on a different moral code from humans, which makes peaceful coexistence between them difficult, if not impossible long term, then any other conversation we could have about this topic becomes a non-starter. There's a reason we've been here over an hour now, and it's precisely because we keep looping on this fundamental disagreement. And until it's resolved, any conversation we can have will just devolve into going, "What the hell are you talking about?"
An actor moving on to another project doesn't make the character's death any more satisfying or coherent in the story.
Perhaps not, but even if we don't like it, we can understand it and hope it'll be handled well.
A character making a stupid decision because they were emotional doesn't make the stupid decision any less stupid.
So? I don't want every character to be a paragon of intelligence, I want them to be internally consistent. Peter Quill hitting Thanos on account of Gamora's death is a stupid decision made out of emotion that causes their plan to unravel. If it wasn't also entirely in character, then we'd have a writing problem on our hands. But because it is entirely in character, people accept that scene more readily.
Explanations can only serve to smooth out the consistency of the world, but criticism often extends far beyond that.
Hold up. Is this going the direction I think it's going? So, given we're looking at this from a meta discussion, let me lay out the forms of criticism I'm aware of. We have criticism that says, this aspect doesn't make sense based on the rules established earlier. This could be a character arriving earlier than we'd expect them to arrive due to travel time. It could be someone making a dumb decision not because it's in character, but because the plot demands it to move forward. That sort of thing. There's also criticism about the themes. How well does a particular work explore or express an idea? Arcane Season 1, for instance, has a strong anti-violence message, which is rarely expressed explicitly, but makes itself felt through almost every fight in the show having a notable negative consequence. This is what I'd call a good exploration of a theme. However, there is also criticism that speaks to the kind of moral or social message a work may, or arguably should, have. This is something I don't indulge in, since it crosses over from critiquing the work to exploring how well it aligns with our real-world morals or ethics. For instance, the person who says that Edelgard did everything wrong in Fire Emblem Three Houses is not giving a critique of the game, but instead the character as if she were a real person, critiquing her methods chosen to accomplish her aim even if her actions make sense from a writing standpoint. And yes, I am that person, Blue Lion's best house. So if this is going the way I expect, you're going to try focusing on the moral message, the fact that we're categorizing an entire group of human-looking creatures as evil. If so, you would ironically be confirming everything these tweets said about you by being incapable of separating a human-looking creature in a fictional setting from real-life people. So, am I correct?
And this is especially important to keep in mind when the criticism made is of some meta element of the text, and the response is to use the text to defend it.
I see. You were more concerned about the fact that demons are looked upon as irredeemable monsters, instead of the fact that it makes sense that they would be seen that way from a writing standpoint. In that light, I can't help but wonder if your poor arguments in favor of the demons being able to express empathy is an unintentional blind spot, or a willful twisting of the truth in service of a narrative. You clearly still think that it matters for a work to be internally consistent, or else the first 40 minutes wouldn't exist, but seem either unable to either argue effectively in its favor, or willing to spin what's going on in favor of saying, hey, there's a flaw here, therefore we can change it in a way that makes me happy. You want to see the demons as being able to express empathy, as it lets you take a crowbar to the idea that a group of human-like creatures is ontologically evil. I want to view the demons as incapable of empathy because it fits in better with the story being told, without any regard for exterior moral concerns. If this is true, we have been talking across from each other this entire time.
The author is in complete control of this world and can override it in any way they want. It's not real. So they may choose to make decisions that best suit the pre-existing logic of the universe, but ultimately, they can make the logic of the universe anything they please at any time. And if you've ever heard of what a retcon is, you've seen a common example of the many ways an author can bend that logic to fit their will.
That is true, and the writers made the story they wanted. What are you implying by saying this? Are we going to impugn on the writer's intellectual freedom just because a part of the story's world is distasteful to you? If you want a story where the demons are redeemed, just go watch Demon Slayer like a normal person. Don't tell us a story we already like has to change just to satisfy your preference. That attitude is precisely the reason why so many in the anime community hate localizers, because far too many seem to believe themselves writers and editors instead of translators, that they can't just let a story be as is and shared as is, but have to make it for a so-called wider audience that won't be interested anyway.
Getting back on topic, something you have to understand is that Tolkien's dilemma wasn't one of internal consistency, that the orcs weren't 100% following the logic of his world. He had complete control over that, after all. He could just change the way the world works. Morgoth is just able to create creatures with souls who are irredeemably evil. Boom, solved.
It was, and it wasn't. Tolkien's writing problem was that he needed to create a way to make the orcs ontologically evil, but the world as he wrote it doesn't allow for that, which adds an inconsistency to his work. If it were possible for Morgoth to create souls that are ontologically evil, that would give him the same level of power as the main creator deity, and fundamentally change the core tenets of how the world works, how souls work, and how everyone views morality within it. Suddenly, it's no longer a struggle between good and a corrupting evil, but instead a choice between two diametrically opposed centers of power that are constantly at war with each other. It's no longer Middle-earth as we understand it at that point.
No, his dilemma stemmed from asking why he would write a universe with that logic in the first place.
Because limitation breeds creativity, and because that's the story he wanted to tell. Next question.
That's why even his multiple different backstories didn't fix anything. His potential changes always clashed with his real-life religious views, his real-life morality. And so, they clashed with the themes of his story being about overcoming evil and the possibility of redemption.
Oh, so you recognize why that Morgoth change would be for the worst, and yet when he takes that lesser of two evils, namely making the orc origin more ambiguous, that's suddenly a problem now?
My criticisms of Frieren flow in this same way. I focused on the contradictions of the text as obvious points of contention, places where the story tells us one thing and shows another. That's easy.
Do I even need to repeat myself at this point?
But my core issue with the demons being irredeemably evil is larger than the consistency of the story's logic, because the morality, themes, and ideals of a story exist outside of that.
So you're a culture critic then? You're annoyed because people didn't engage you on that level outside of trash talk from your ideological opposition, while the more reasonable voices were focused on the citation needed for the contradictions that you thought were so blindingly obvious.
You can smooth out the logic of the world as much as you want, explain why the demons are the way that they are as definitively as you can, but doing so does not change or justify what a world created to be like that is promoting. What its logic is telling the audience it values.
Then there is nothing more to discuss. With these last couple of minutes, you have made it clear to me that you are not interested in storytelling for storytelling's sake, but are instead an activist who wishes to see stories made that promote a certain worldview. There is a script sitting on my computer entitled "Keep Your Politics to Yourself," and it is precisely because of videos like this that that script exists and will be made into a full video at some point. It's not enough to just have a compelling story with fun characters and cool visuals. It has to have a certain moral character as well. Even if a story does have those elements, it's not enough to just appreciate a tale like that as an isolated story if we're not prepared to engage with it on that level. We must acknowledge the underlying moral and social aspect of it, focusing on those moral aspects above good storytelling. Insisting that something must be changed regardless of a writer's wishes, just because you don't think a certain tale should be told. Care to dispel my impression of you?
Or if a story with that logic is even good in the first place.
I rest my case. Thank you for the discussion, as this did challenge me to think more critically about some aspects of both Frieren and Tolkien's work. But if your primary focus is in the message conveyed, then we are having two different conversations, and I am not interested in pursuing the conversation you wish to have any further. So to the rest of you watching, if you want to see the rest of the video, I stopped slightly before the 47-minute mark. Apologies that this ran for so long, as I had more to say than I expected when I first sat down to watch this, and my voice absolutely hates me for it, holy crap. But hopefully the timestamps in the description made it easier to focus on the parts you were more interested in. Even if you're one of the people who just wanted to see someone dunk on this video and skip to the quote fun part, whatever that might be. Still, thank you all for stopping by, and feel free to tell me how wrong I am in the comments below. As I said at the start, this is my first time making a video like this, and due to my approach, it may have made more sense to post on my review channel, since instead of a video game or TV show, I'm reviewing someone else's video. But I haven't posted on there in a while, and I didn't want the return to be something so different from my usual fare. Still, it was kind of fun to break away from my review and livestream niche, so I may do more like this as the mood strikes. For now then, thank you all once again for watching, and I'll see you all later.